Sarah Martin hurried down the dimly lit street, clutching her worn leather bag close to her chest. The autumn wind whipped through her dark hair as she made her way home from another exhausting late shift at Murphy's diner. Her feet ached in her waitressing shoes, and all she could think about was crawling into bed. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting strange shadows on the cracked sidewalk. Sarah quickened her pace, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. That's when she first noticed the orange tabby cat following her. It was a scruffy thing, with matted fur and a notched ear that spoke of street fights. The cat padded silently behind her, maintaining a steady distance. Sarah had seen plenty of strays in this part of town, but something about this one caught her attention. Its yellow eyes seemed unusually alert, almost protective. She was 3 blocks from her apartment when she heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, gaining on her quickly. Before she could react, a rough hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. The street light revealed a man in a dark hoodie, his face partially concealed. "Give me the bag," he growled, pulling out a knife that glinted in the dim light. Sarah's throat constricted with fear. Her tips from the day were in that bag, money she desperately needed for rent. But before she could respond, an orange blur shot through the air with a fierce yowl. The stray cat launched itself at the mugger's face, claws extended. The man screamed, stumbling backward as sharp claws raked across his skin. The knife clattered to the ground as he tried to protect his face from the furious feline assault. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear the mugger's cursing fade away as he fled in the opposite direction. When she finally reached her apartment building, she stopped to catch her breath. To her amazement, the orange tabby sat calmly at her feet, looking up at her with those intelligent eyes as if checking if she was all right. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, still shaking from the encounter. She dug in her bag and pulled out a piece of chicken from her dinner leftovers, offering it to her unlikely savior. The cat accepted the offering gracefully, but didn't run away after finishing. Instead, it followed her up to her apartment door. Sarah hesitated, then made a decision that would change her life forever. "Would you like to come in?" The cat walked past her into the apartment as if it had lived there all its life. As Sarah closed the door behind them, she noticed something odd, a small metal tag hanging from what remained of a worn collar, almost completely hidden by the matted fur. Her hands trembling slightly, Sarah knelt down to examine it. The tag was old and scratched, but she could just make out an address and a name, Max. What she discovered next made her blood run cold. The address on the tag belonged to a house just a few blocks away, a house that had been abandoned for over a decade after a mysterious fire claimed the lives of its owners. Sarah looked at the cat, at Max, with new eyes. Something told her this was more than just a simple case of a stray cat coming to her rescue. There was a story here, one that had been waiting years to be told. She had no idea that by letting this mysterious feline into her home, she had just become entangled in a web of secrets that would unravel the dark history of her neighborhood and change her understanding of loyalty, justice, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Max settled onto her worn couch, those knowing yellow eyes fixed on her face, as if saying, "Now that you're ready, let me show you the truth." The next morning, Sarah called in sick to Murphy's diner for the first time in 2 years. She couldn't shake the feeling that Max's appearance in her life wasn't a coincidence. The cat had made himself at home, claiming a spot on her windowsill where he could watch the street below with unwavering attention. After making a cup of coffee, Sarah examined the tag more carefully in the morning light. The address belonged to 1247 Oakwood Street, the infamous Mason house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the story, or at least thought they did. 10 years ago, James and Eleanor Mason had perished in a house fire that consumed their historic Victorian home. The case was ruled an accident, blamed on faulty wiring, but rumors had persisted for years. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching. The local newspaper archives revealed more details about the Masons. James had been a retired detective, and Eleanor was a beloved elementary school teacher. They were well respected in the community, known for their charitable work and kindness to animals. The article mentioned they had several pets, including an orange tabby cat that was never found after the fire. A knock at her door made Sarah jump. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor from across the hall. The old woman's eyes widened when she saw Max. "That cat," Mrs. Chen whispered, pointing a trembling finger. "I remember him. He belonged to the Masons. I used to see Eleanor walking him on a leash, can you imagine? A cat on a leash." She shook her head, then lowered her voice. "But that was 10 years ago. It cannot be the same cat." Yet the evidence was right in front of them. The unique pattern of orange stripes, the notched ear that Mrs. Chen remembered from a fight with another neighborhood cat, and most convincingly, the tag with the Mason's address. "The night of the fire," Mrs. Chen continued, settling into Sarah's armchair, "something strange happened. I was visiting my daughter that weekend, but my friend Mrs. Sullivan lived next door to the Masons. She told me she saw James Mason arguing with someone in his driveway just hours before the fire. She said James seemed scared, and James Mason was not a man who scared easily." Sarah leaned forward. "Did she see who he was arguing with?" Mrs. Chen shook her head. "A man in a dark suit," she said. "Very expensive looking. She thought it was strange because it was nearly midnight. The next morning, the house was in ashes." Max jumped down from the windowsill and padded over to Sarah's laptop, where an old photograph of the Masons stood in front of their house was displayed. The cat placed his paw on the screen, directly over James Mason's face. "There's something else," Mrs. Chen said, watching Max carefully. "A week before the fire, I overheard Eleanor telling Mrs. Sullivan that James had discovered something during his last case before retirement, something that made him nervous. He'd started keeping files in a safety deposit box at Brighton Bank." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Did anyone check the safety deposit box after they died?" "The police did, sir, but according to Mrs. Sullivan, it was empty by then." Mrs. Chen stood up slowly, her joints creaking. "You know, dear, some people said James Mason wasn't really retired, that he was still investigating something big, something dangerous." After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah sat on her couch, processing everything. Max jumped up beside her, purring softly. How had this cat survived all these years, and why had he chosen to help her last night? Looking into Max's intelligent eyes, Sarah made a decision. She would visit the ruins of the Mason house. Perhaps there were answers there that had been overlooked. The house stood at the end of Oakwood Street, a charred skeleton of its former grandeur. Yellow warning tape and "no trespassing" signs hung from the rusted fence. But the gate was unlocked. Max had followed her, seeming more alert than ever. As Sarah approached the house, she noticed something odd. Despite being abandoned for a decade, there were fresh footprints in the dust leading to the back of the property. Someone had been here recently. Max suddenly tensed, his fur standing on end. Sarah heard a car approaching slowly down the street. Through the overgrown bushes, she glimpsed a black sedan with tinted windows, moving at a crawl. The same kind of car she'd seen parked outside her diner several times over the past month. Her heart pounding, Sarah ducked behind a large oak tree. Max pressed against her legs, silent but vigilant. The car stopped briefly in front of the house, then continued on. When Sarah looked down, Max was pawing at something half buried in the soil near the tree's roots. She knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt, revealing a small, rusted tin box. Inside, protected from the elements, she found a single photograph. It showed James Mason shaking hands with a group of men in suits. On the back, written in faded ink, was a message: "Insurance policy. If anything happens to us, the truth is in the cat's cradle." Sarah stared at Max, who looked back at her with those knowing eyes. The cat's cradle. It had been Eleanor Mason's favorite bar before it closed down 5 years ago. It was now a vacant building, just a few blocks from Murphy's diner. As she stood there, holding the photograph, Sarah realized she was now part of something much bigger than a simple rescue by a stray cat. Max had been waiting all these years, guarding secrets that someone had killed to protect. And now, for whatever reason, he had chosen her to help uncover the truth. The sound of the black sedan returning snapped Sarah back to reality. She quickly pocketed the photograph and followed Max through a gap in the back fence. Whatever was going on, one thing was clear. Someone was still very interested in the Mason house, even after all these years, and they probably wouldn't be happy to know that Sarah had found this photograph. Sarah spent the next few days watching Murphy's diner carefully during her shifts, paying special attention to the customers. The black sedan appeared twice more, always parking across the street for exactly 30 minutes before driving away. The driver never came inside. Max had taken to following her to work, keeping watch from the alley beside the diner. Some of her regular customers had noticed him, commenting on the unusual behavior of what they assumed was just another stray. But Sarah knew better now. One rainy evening, just before closing time, an elderly man she'd never seen before sat in her section. He ordered nothing but coffee, his gnarled hands trembling slightly as he reached for the cup. What caught Sarah's attention was Max's reaction. The cat had moved from his usual spot to sit directly in front of the diner's window, staring intently at the old man. "Excuse me," the man called out as Sarah passed his table. "That orange cat, he's been watching me since I arrived." Sarah hesitated, then sat down across from him. The diner was empty except for them, and something in the man's eyes told her this wasn't a coincidence. "My name is Frank Sullivan," he said quietly, "and I used to work with James Mason." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You were a detective?" Frank shook his head. "Building maintenance at the police station. I cleaned his office every night for 15 years. James was one of the few who actually talked to me, treated me like a person." He glanced out the window at Max. "That cat. I'd recognize him anywhere. He used to visit the station with James sometimes." Sarah pulled out the photograph she'd found at the Mason house. Frank's hands shook more visibly as he examined it. "The last few weeks before he died, James was different," Frank continued. "He started staying late at the station, looking through old case files. Said something about patterns he'd missed, connections he should have seen sooner." He pointed to one of the men in the photograph. "This man here, Thomas Brighton, he used to own half the properties in this neighborhood, including this diner." "Used to. After the Mason fire, he sold everything and disappeared. Nobody's heard from him since." Frank looked around nervously. James had a theory about Brighton's real estate dealings, something about the buildings that kept catching fire, always being bought for pennies on the dollar by shell companies. Sarah thought about the Cat's Cradle bar, its charred remains still standing just a few blocks away. "Were there other fires?" Frank nodded. 7 mysterious fires in 5 years, all in buildings Brighton had tried to buy, but the owners refused to sell, until they couldn't afford to rebuild, that is. He handed the photograph back to Sarah. "The night before he died, James called me, said he'd finally found proof, something in an old insurance claim that tied everything together. He was going to take it to the FBI in the morning." But morning never came for James and Eleanor Mason. "There's something else," Frank said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The night of the fire. I was working late. I saw James put something in his office trash can. When I went to empty it later, I found this." He pulled an old as crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and smoothed it out carefully. It was a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, with several buildings circled in red. The Cat's Cradle was among them, along with a series of numbers and letters that made no sense to Sarah. "I've kept this for 10 years, never knowing if it meant anything," Frank said. "But when I saw that cat outside, the same cat, I knew it was time." He stood up slowly. "James was a good man. He deserved better than to have his death swept under the rug as an accident." As Frank headed for the door, he turned back. "Be careful who you trust, Sarah. The people behind this, they're still here, still watching. They never really left." After Frank departed, Sarah locked up the diner and headed home, Max following close behind. Her mind was racing with questions. Why had the cat chosen now to appear? What was in the Cat's Cradle that was so important? When she reached her apartment, she found her door slightly ajar. Her heart pounding, she peered inside. The place had been searched, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned. But the intruders had missed the most important thing. The photograph and map were safely in her pocket. Max slipped past her into the apartment, making a beeline for her bedroom. Sarah followed, watching as the cat pawed at a loose floorboard she'd never noticed before. When she pried it up, she found a small cavity beneath, perfect for hiding things that shouldn't be found. As she cleaned up the mess left by the intruders, Sarah's phone rang. It was her boss from the diner. "Sarah, 2 men were just here asking questions about you. They said they were police but something felt off. They were especially interested in whether you'd been talking to any elderly customers today." Sarah thanked her boss and hung up, her hands trembling. She looked at Max, who sat watching her with those knowing eyes. "Okay," she said aloud. "I guess we're going to the Cat's Cradle tonight." What she didn't know was that someone had been listening through her thin apartment walls. And they were already making a phone call of their own. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but Sarah was beginning to realize that some truths came with a price. As she prepared to venture out to the abandoned bar, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into something that had been set in motion long before Max came into her life. The cat jumped onto her windowsill, his attention focused on the street below. In the gathering darkness, a black sedan rolled slowly past her building, its headlights off. They were running out of time. The Cat's Cradle stood like a dark sentinel in the moonlight, its burned-out windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Sarah approached cautiously, Max leading the way with confident steps. The cat seemed to know exactly where he was going. The bar's front entrance was boarded up, but Max led her to a narrow alley on the side of the building. There, hidden behind overgrown weeds, was a rusty cellar door. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight, illuminating years of neglect and decay. The padlock on the door was new, though, shiny brass against the weathered metal. Someone else had been here recently. Before Sarah could consider her next move, Max squeezed through a small gap where the door hadn't closed properly against its frame. She heard his soft meow from below, encouraging her to follow. The gap was barely wide enough, but Sarah managed to slide through, dropping down into the musty darkness of the cellar. Her flashlight beam revealed rows of dusty wine racks and stacked chairs. The air was thick with the smell of old smoke and decay. Max's eyes glowed in the darkness as he led her deeper into the basement, past fallen beams and debris from the fire that had closed the bar 5 years ago. At the far end of the cellar, Max stopped in front of what appeared to be a solid brick wall. But when Sarah ran her hands over the bricks, she felt one that was slightly loose. Behind it, she found a small cavity containing a sealed mason jar. Inside the jar was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it. "To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, then they finally got to us. The evidence on this drive proves what I discovered about Thomas Brighton and his partners. The fires, the fraudulent insurance claims, the offshore accounts where they hid the money. It's all here. I'm trusting this to Max. He always was smarter than most humans I knew. James Mason." The sound of footsteps above made Sarah freeze. Flashlight beams swept across the ceiling as multiple people moved through the bar's main floor. She quickly pocketed the jar and pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. "Check the basement," a muffled voice ordered. "The girl's car is parked around the corner. She's here somewhere." Sarah heard the cellar door creak open, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Max suddenly darted forward, deliberately knocking over a stack of chairs. The crash echoed through the basement. "Over there!" a voice shouted. As flashlight beams swung toward the noise, Sarah used the distraction to slip behind a large wine rack. Through the dusty bottles, she could make out 3 men in dark suits moving cautiously through the cellar. "Find her," one of them growled. "Brighton wants that drive. And if you see that damn cat, shoot it. It's caused enough trouble." Sarah's blood ran cold. These weren't random burglars. They knew about the drive, about Max, about everything. She needed to escape, but they were between her and the only exit. Max appeared again, knocking over more chairs on the opposite side of the cellar. 2 of the men rushed toward the noise. The third man started methodically checking behind each wine rack, moving closer to Sarah's hiding spot. Just as his flashlight beam was about to reach her, the lights suddenly blazed on in the cellar. Everyone froze. "Police! Don't move!" Sarah recognized Frank Sullivan's voice, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps rushing down the stairs. The man near her wine rack raised his gun, but before he could fire, an orange blur launched itself at his face. Max's attack gave the police the moment they needed. In the chaos that followed, Sarah learned the truth. Frank hadn't just been building maintenance. He'd been an undercover FBI agent for 30 years, using his janitorial position to gather intelligence. He'd been working with James Mason on the Brighton case. but they could never gather enough evidence to bring charges. James knew they were closing in, Frank explained later at the police station. He split up the evidence, the USB drive here, other documents in different locations. He trained Max to remember where everything was hidden. But how did Max survive all these years? Sarah asked, scratching behind the cat's ears as he purred contentedly in her lap. Mrs. Chen, Frank smiled. She'd been feeding him, keeping him safe. She was James's cousin, though most people didn't know that. She kept an eye on Max until he found someone he could trust to help finish what James started. The USB drive contained everything needed to bring down Brighton's organization. The man had been using arson to force property owners to sell, then collecting massive insurance payouts through fraudulent claims. When James Mason discovered the truth, Brighton had him killed. But why did Max choose me? Sarah wondered aloud. Frank's expression softened. James used to say that cats can see into people's souls. Max must have seen something special in you, the same kind of courage and determination that James had. As Sarah drove home that night, Max riding shotgun in her passenger seat, she thought about how a series of seemingly random events, a mugging, a stray cat, an old photograph, had led to justice being served after 10 long years. But there was one more surprise waiting for her. A week after the arrests at the Cat's Cradle, Sarah sat in her apartment, going through a box of documents the FBI had cleared for her to examine. Max lounged on the windowsill, seemingly content that his mission was finally complete. The morning paper lay on her coffee table, its headline announcing Thomas Brighton's arrest in the Cayman Islands. His entire network was unraveling, with former associates rushing to make deals with prosecutors. The truth about the Mason murders and countless other crimes was finally coming to light. But something still nagged at Sarah. Why had James Mason hidden the evidence in locations connected to his cat? Frank's explanation about Max being trained felt incomplete somehow. Her answer came in the form of a letter delivered by Mrs. Chen that morning. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age. Inside she found a letter dated just days before the Mason fire. Dear Sarah Martin, if you're reading this, then Max has found you, just as I hoped he would. You see, I've been watching you at Murphy's Diner for the past few months. I've seen your kindness to others, your strength in facing daily struggles, and most importantly, your refusal to look away from injustice. You probably wonder how I could write to you, someone I've never met all those years ago. The truth is, I knew your father. Robert Martin was my partner on the force for 15 years before his death in the line of duty. You were only 5 when he died, too young to remember him. But I remember how he would talk about his little girl, how she would grow up to be someone special. When I discovered Brighton's criminal enterprise, I knew they would come for me. So I devised a plan. Max was more than just a pet. He was trained by a specialist to recognize specific people through photographs and to protect them. I showed him pictures of you for months, knowing that someday he would need to find you. The evidence couldn't be entrusted to the police. Brighton had too many officers in his pocket. It needed to go to someone pure, someone outside the system, someone with your father's courage. I've arranged for Mrs. Chen, my cousin, to watch over Max until the time was right. There's one more thing you should know. Your father didn't die in a random shooting, as you were told. He discovered something about Brighton's operations, just as I did years later. His death was made to look like a robbery gone wrong. In the bottom of this box, you'll find your father's badge and a trust fund I set up in your name. Brighton's men never found it. The money came from your father's life insurance. I've been managing it all these years, waiting for the right moment. You deserve to know the truth about your father. He was a hero, Sarah, and from what I've seen, so are you. Take care of Max for me. He's more than just a cat. He's a guardian, a keeper of secrets, and now, finally, a deliverer of justice. With gratitude and hope, James Mason. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached deeper into the box, finding a worn police badge and documents for a trust fund that would ensure she'd never have to worry about money again. But it was another item that brought tears to her eyes, a photograph she'd never seen before, showing her father holding her as a baby, both of them smiling at the camera. Max jumped down from his perch and rubbed against her legs, purring loudly. Sarah picked him up, holding him close as tears rolled down her cheeks. All these years he'd been waiting, watching, preparing for the moment when he could bring everything full circle. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, smiling gently. James always said that justice finds its way, even if it takes a lifetime, and sometimes it needs a little help from unexpected places. Sarah wiped her eyes, looking around her small apartment with new understanding. Her father's killer had been caught, the Masons' deaths had been avenged, and somehow, through it all, a remarkable cat had brought healing to wounds she hadn't even known she carried. But there was still one piece of the puzzle left, and it would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her own destiny. The following evening, Frank Sullivan asked Sarah to meet him at the police station. The old building looked different now that she knew its true significance, not just to the Masons' case, but to her own history. Max insisted on coming along, padding silently beside her as she walked through the largely empty halls. Frank was waiting in a small conference room, surrounded by boxes of old case files. His face bore the weary but satisfied look of a man who had finally completed a decades-long mission. "There's something you need to see," he said, pulling out a dusty VHS tape. "We found this in Brighton's private vault after his arrest. It's security footage from the night your father died." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I thought it was a random shooting. That's what everyone told me." Frank shook his head sadly. "Watch." The footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed her father, Robert Martin, working late at his desk. He was younger than in her memories, but she recognized his kind face, the way he ran his hands through his hair when deep in thought. In the video, he suddenly looked up, startled by someone off camera. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m. Her father stood, reaching for something in his desk drawer. Then the footage abruptly cut out. "That was the night," Frank said quietly. "But there's more. This was taken an hour earlier." He played another clip. This time, she saw her father talking to James Mason in the parking lot. They were looking at some papers, her father gesturing animatedly, and there, sitting on the hood of Mason's car, was a younger Max, watching the two men intently. "Your father discovered Brighton's insurance fraud scheme first," Frank explained. "He and James were working together, gathering evidence. But someone tipped Brighton off." He paused, his face darkening. "So we now know it was the police chief himself. He was on Brighton's payroll." Sarah felt a cold anger rising inside her. "So they killed him to keep him quiet?" "Yes, but they didn't find what they were looking for that night. Your father had hidden his evidence somewhere in this building. James spent years trying to find it, but never could." Frank leaned forward. "Sarah, I think you're meant to finish what they started. Both your father and James left clues that only you could follow." Max suddenly jumped onto the conference table, walking purposefully to an old photograph on the wall. It showed the police station's original construction in 1975. The cat pawed at a specific spot in the image. Sarah looked closer. In the photograph, workers were installing the stone cornerstone of the building, and there, barely visible in the background, was a familiar face, her grandfather, who had been the construction foreman. "The cornerstone," she whispered. "Dad would have known about it from his father." Within hours, with the police chief's permission, they had carefully removed the cornerstone. Behind it, preserved in a watertight container, they found a stack of documents, photographs, and a letter from Robert Martin to his daughter. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've discovered something terrible, something that goes beyond mere criminal activity. Brighton isn't just burning buildings, he's destroying lives, communities, hopes and dreams. I'm writing this because I know they're coming for me. But I want you to know that everything I did for you. For the kind of world I wanted you to live in. James has promised to watch over you, to make sure you're safe until you're ready to know the truth. There's a final piece to this puzzle, one that will ensure Brighton can never hurt anyone again. I've hidden it somewhere only my daughter would think to look. Remember the stories I used to tell you, about the special place where dreams come true. I love you more than life itself. Dad." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the letter. She knew exactly where her father meant. Every Sunday before his death, he would take her to the old carousel in Henderson Park. They would sit on the painted horses, and he would tell her stories about a magical place where justice always prevailed and good people were protected. The carousel had been closed for years now, standing silent and forgotten in the abandoned park. But Sarah knew it held one last secret, one that would finally bring everything full circle. Max rubbed against her legs, purring loudly. The cat's mission wasn't quite finished yet. There was one more truth to uncover, one that would not only complete her father's work, but would also reveal why James Mason had chosen this particular cat to be his messenger of justice. As Sarah left the police station that night, she noticed something she'd missed before. In the old construction photograph, partially hidden behind the workers, was a small orange cat watching the cornerstone being laid. On its collar was a familiar tag. Some things, it seemed, were meant to be mysteries. The old carousel in Henderson Park stood silently in the pre-dawn light, its once bright paint faded and peeling. Sarah approached it slowly, Max trotting confidently beside her. Frank Sullivan and Mrs. Chen waited in a car nearby, keeping watch. The painted horses seemed to stare at her with knowing eyes as she walked past them, searching for the one she remembered from her childhood, a black stallion with a golden mane, her father's favorite. He would always lift her onto this particular horse, telling her it was magical, that it kept special secrets safe. Max jumped onto the platform and walked directly to the black stallion, pawing at its base. Sarah knelt down, running her hands over the weathered wood. There, a small seam, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. With trembling fingers, she pressed the hidden catch her father had shown her so many years ago. A small compartment clicked open inside the hollow base of the horse. What she found inside made her breath catch. A small diary, its pages yellow with age, filled with her father's handwriting. Bank accounts, dates, names, a complete record of Brighton's criminal empire dating back 30 years. But more than that, there were photographs proving the involvement of high-ranking officials, business leaders, and criminals across the country. "This is why they killed him," Sarah whispered, understanding at last. "This isn't just about insurance fraud and arson. This is about decades of corruption at every level." A sudden noise made her spin around. Thomas Brighton himself stood at the carousel's entrance, having somehow escaped custody. He held a gun pointed steadily at her. "Your father was too stubborn to make a deal," Brighton said, his voice eerily calm. "James Mason, too. Now here you are, the last loose end." "You killed them both," Sarah said, anger overriding her fear. "You destroyed so many lives, all for money." Brighton smiled coldly. "Money is power, my dear. Your father never understood that. Neither did Mason. Now give me the diary." Max, who had been hidden behind the horses, suddenly leaped at Brighton with a fierce yowl. The surprise attack made him stumble, the gun going off harmlessly into the air. Sarah dove for cover as more shots rang out. Then she heard new voices, Frank and the police, rushing in with weapons drawn. Brighton tried to run but slipped on the wet grass. As he fell, something fell from his pocket, an old photograph. Sarah picked it up after Brighton was handcuffed. It showed a much younger Brighton standing in front of the Mason house, and there in the background was Max, watching from a window. The same cat, somehow unchanged by time, had been witnessing everything for decades. "It's impossible," Brighton muttered as the police led him away. "That cat, it's been haunting me for 30 years. Never aging, never dying, always watching. What is it?" Mrs. Chen approached Sarah, smiling mysteriously. "Some things in this world cannot be explained, only accepted. Max has been a guardian of justice for longer than any of us know. Your father understood this. So did James Mason." Sarah looked at Max, who sat calmly washing his paw as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Perhaps he was just a remarkable cat who had lived an unusually long life. Or perhaps he was something more, a spirit of justice that took the form of a simple orange tabby, helping those who fought for what was right. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that justice had finally been served. Brighton's entire network was exposed, and dozens of corrupt officials faced charges. The diary provided evidence for cold cases going back decades. 1 month later, Sarah stood in front of the rebuilt Mason house. The city had purchased it, turning it into a community center for underprivileged children. A small plaque honored the memories of Robert Martin and James Mason, two men who gave their lives fighting corruption. She had used part of her trust fund to create a special wing dedicated to caring for stray animals. Max spent his days there, watching over the children and cats with the same vigilant eyes that had watched over so many secrets for so long. "You know, Mrs. Chen said one day, as they watched Max teaching a group of kittens to climb the center's cat trees. "Some say there have always been guardian cats in this world. They appear when they're needed most, helping those who fight for justice. The ancient Egyptians believed cats could walk between worlds, seeing things we cannot see." Sarah smiled, watching Max guide a small orange kitten that looked just like him. Maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. The kitten looked up at her with wise, knowing eyes, and for a moment Sarah saw in them the same determination she'd seen in Max when he first came to her rescue. Perhaps another guardian was being trained, preparing for the day when it would be needed to help another soul fight for justice. Max caught her eye and blinked slowly, as if to say his work here was done. Sarah had found her purpose, continuing the legacy of her father and James Mason, helping those who couldn't help themselves. And she knew that whenever darkness threatened to overwhelm the light, there would always be guardians watching, waiting, ready to help those who dared to stand up for what was right. The orange kitten curled up next to Max, both of them purring contentedly in the warm afternoon sun. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, its dark secrets now exposed to the light, its future brighter because of an unlikely partnership between a waitress, two brave men, and a remarkable orange cat who proved that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come in the most ordinary forms. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.